Firstly, thank you so much, ma'am, for giving me the opportunity to share my strategy for paper one. And I would like to thank you as well as Sleepy classes. And firstly, I would like to tell my scores to the viewers. I scored 260. I gave 3 mains from PSIR optional. The first mains in 2020, I got to a score of 260. And then in my second mains in 2021, I got a score of 243. The marks reduced by 17. And then in the third mains, I got the score of 295. And in this, for paper one, which I'm going to discuss today, my score was 149 in this year. So in this session, I plan to discuss the questions and how I approached them. I would only discuss the basic outline due to time limitations, and then we can have the floor open to questions from the participants. So I hope we can start, and I would directly start with question number 1A, and I would proceed in the order in which I attempted the questions in the actual exam. I attempted 2 questions from section A, so I would discuss them: question number 1, 3, 4, then question number 5, and then question number 8, because that is the order in which I attempted these questions. And after these, I would discuss the remaining questions in brief. So without delay, I would start with question number 1A. And question number 1A was about systems approach. So in this question, systems approach, we have basically 2 pages to fill. And in those 2 pages, what I did was, firstly, see, I followed the basic template. I would firstly mention that template that I followed, and then I would try to implement it in all my answers. In the basic template, basic structure that I followed to answer all of the answers was that I would first start with intro, which would basically involve definition of the concept. After intro, in the second para, I would give a historical context. After giving a historical context from third para onwards, I would address the main body. And then towards the end, in the last 2 or 3 paras, I would try to write criticism and interlinks with other scholars, and then conclusion. So this is the basic template that I try to follow in all my answers. And in this question also, I would start with this 1A and how I try to apply this here. So in intro, I defined what is systems approach and how it is the scientific way to study political science, and mentioned David Easton's name. That would be the intro, defining systems approach as a scientific way to study politics. And after introduction, in second para, I would write about history of, in historical context in which systems approach emerged. That is, it emerged in post World War II era, when questions were being raised on relevance of political science and political theory had degenerated. So that would be the historical context that I would mention in the second para. And from third para onwards, I would try to move on to the main body and discuss the features of systems approach. So the features that David Easton gave in his theory, I would mention that, and there is that diagram which you can draw like this. This is a diagram which is there, which you can draw here. So mentioning all the regularization technique, verification, value neutrality, measurement, all these features you can explain in a bit, and then you can draw this diagram. It would occupy around 1 page, and after that we can write some criticism of systems theory in, say, 1 page or 1 paragraph, sorry, criticism in 1 para. And we can use Leo Strauss's words that it is means value neutrality leads to loss of relevance from the discipline, or Sheldon Wolin's comment, or Marxist's criticism, or the lack of structures and functions in systems approach. All this we can discuss in brief in 1 or 2 paras, and after criticism we can move on to conclusion, how that this approach was too simple and it led to the evolution of structural functional approach of Almond and Powell. So in this way, we can do the conclusion, and that was my basic template for answering question 1A on systems approach. So this thing that I tried to show over here, this structure I would try to follow in all my answers as we move ahead. So now question 1B, we are moving on to question 1B, and 1B is about cultural relativism. So in cultural relativism, firstly, in first para, I would define cultural relativism, that what is actually meant by cultural relativism, that it believes that there is no universal culture and no universal set of values, and the values that different culture worship are different across geographies and across cultures. So like that. And if you can remember, see in the actual exam, I did not know that this concept was given by Franz Boas. But if you know that this concept was given by Franz Boas and you write it in your introduction, then it would surely add value to your answer, and it will impress the examiner as well. So after defining cultural relativism in the first para, in second para, I would give the historical context in which this cultural relativism emerged, and that was due to the universal application of human rights, as well, which was mentioned in the UN Charter, which was created after World War II. After this, from third para onwards, I would move on to the main body, and in main body, I would discuss what are the features of cultural relativism and how it criticizes universal application of human rights. And after writing a few features of cultural relativism in third, fourth, or say 2 or 3 paras, I would move on to interlinkages. We can interlink cultural relativism with communitarian perspectives, communitarians. We can also interlink it to multiculturalism, and then we can give the Western critique of theory of cultural relativism. So Western scholars basically criticized cultural relativism. Why they criticized it? They criticized it because they said it is justification of totalitarianism by the leaders of third world. So that was the criticism of cultural relativism from the perspective of Western scholars. And then we can conclude that despite the criticism, it is a relevant concept as it talks about cultural autonomy and tries to reduce the influence of uh, Western powers on the post-colonial countries. So in this way, we can conclude by giving some counter criticism to the criticism we mentioned here. So this is how I approached the question number 1B, which was cultural relativism. Now moving on to question 1C, it was revolution in permanence. In permanence. And here I believe that it was one of the toughest questions in this section, that is question 1. And this is because this was a new concept and I did not know it at the time of attempting it, at the time of the paper. I only had a basic idea that Mao Zedong tried to implement in China something called permanent revolution. I was not even sure that revolution in permanence is linked to permanent revolution or not. But since I had to fill 2 pages and I knew only about permanent revolution of Mao Zedong, I mentioned only that. But ma'am has given in a sleepy classes solution also, and I read it and I found it to be relevant that first in intro, if you know, you should introduce that it is a concept given by Leon Trotsky. And you can explain his concept. You can give historical context that it was implemented during Russian Revolution of 1919, and then you can move on to the main body and give some basic features of revolution in permanence as highlighted by one Trotsky, And then after doing that, you can move on to Mao Zedong and how he used this revolution and permanence concept to give his permanent revolution concept. So in Trotsky, you can mention how the revolution in Marxism is supposed to be two-stage revolution, and it has to end when a classless society is formed. But that was conflicted, and Trotsky said that revolution would be permanent, it will never end because of the divide between the East and West. And then you can show how Mao Zedong used it, permanent revolution, for bringing cultural and other kinds of revolution in 1960s to maintain his hold over China. So that is the basic structure you can follow. And after writing all this in your main body, in interlink part, you can interlink it here, because the question is talking about revolution in permanence. You can link it to Marxian revolution, which we have already done. So we will rather not do that. Instead of Marxian revolution, we can talk here about Gramsci and how he talked about two-stage revolution. But instead of that, here we are talking about permanent revolution. And after interlink, you can criticize this concept of revolution in permanence, that it would actually lead to a lot of unrest, and it was not implemented successfully in China. So that is criticism. And then you can conclude by giving that despite these limitations, it was an impressive idea which captured the imagination of Marxists in early part of 20th century. So in this way you can conclude it, and that would work for 1C, I guess. So now we are moving on to 1D. And 1D, the question is basically basis of power. Again, here there are some doubts, and firstly I would tell you what I wrote in the exam, and then I would tell you what I think is the correct answer. In exam, I did not know anything about basis of power. It is a term I came across for the first time. I think it is there for those who have studied sociology optional, they know it better, but I came across it for the first time in the exam, and I did not have much idea. So I went with the basic knowledge that everyone have on power, which was after writing some intro that power is the currency of politics and all that. And then in the main body, I basically wrote about liberal theory of power, Marxist theory of power, elitist theory of power, and pluralist theory of power, like that postmodernist theory of power. I tried to explain all of them in one para, and that was basically what I thought is this question about. But after coming back, when I googled it, then I found that basis of power is actually a concept given in 1959 by social psychologist John French and Bertram Raven. So it was given by John French and Bertram Raven, and they gave basically five bases of power. Five bases of power were given by them, and those are legitimate power, reward power, and there is expert power. Third is expert power. Fourth is referent power, and fifth is coercive power, and later on they added informational power. So these are the five kinds of power which are mentioned, and if you go through Google, you can explore these in detail. You can write one or two lines about them. If this is the correct interpretation and you somehow knew it and wrote it, you would have surely gotten more marks. But since I came across this term for the first time, in my answer in the exam, I wrote this: liberal theory of power, Marxist theory of power, elitist, pluralist, postmodernist, and other feminist and other such theory of powers. That is what I wrote, one para for each of them. But what I think is the correct answer is this one, what I showed later, this part. This is what I think is the correct answer. So that is up for debate. I think Prerna ma'am can guide better here after doing due research. So that is about 1D, and now 1E. This was one of the easier questions, and about traditional lines, it talks about Locke's social contract. So here we can, since we know this question well and other questions were on the tougher side, we need to leverage this to gain more and more marks in this, as many marks as possible. So in intro, you can write about Locke being the father of liberalism and giving his work in two treatises on civil government. In historical context, you can write how he was present during the time of glorious revolution of 1688, which was a peaceful revolution. Then you can, in main body, firstly define what is social contract. Then you can define what according to him is state of human nature, what is state of nature, and how they form two social contracts in Hobbes or in Locke. And you can contrast it with how there is only one social contract in Hobbes. You can say how this leads to his social contract is connected to his theory of limited state and theory of natural rights. You can establish all those interlinkages in the main body, and after this you can criticize his theory of social contract from the perspective of Marxists or from the perspective of modern liberals. And once that is done, you have criticized, you can conclude by saying that despite criticism, this social contract is found in UN Charter and also in Indian preamble. You can even get this idea because there is a question on Indian preamble being social contract in the second part, in the question number 5 as well. So that was the conclusion you could have used for this, and that ends question 1 for us. Now we will move on to the next question which I attempted, and that was question number 3. I did not do question number 2. So I would talk about 3 and 4, which I did, and then I would move on to section B, and we can come back later to question number 2. So I would now talk about 3A. And 3A is examine the liberal theory of state in contemporary politics. Examine the liberal theory of state in contemporary politics. So this is a 20 marker question, and here you have to fill 4 pages, so you can explain it in detail. Now in intro, you can firstly, since it is talking about theory of state, you can firstly introduce it by starting with what is state and how state is very important for political science. You can give definition of state by Max Weber, and then you can say political science begins and ends in state. And after introducing state and highlighting the importance of state in the first para, i.e. introduction, we can move on to the second para. And the second para can basically talk about the historical context of origin of liberal theory of state. That liberal theory of state emerged in the works of Locke and Adam Smith, and it was a transition from medieval era of feudal state to modern liberal states. So that can be your historical context in which you can write in your second para, and after writing the historical context from third para onwards, you can mention various liberal theories of state. You can start with classical liberal theory of state, and then you can move on to modern liberal theory of state. Then you can move on to neoliberal theory of state. Then you can move on to social liberal theory of state. And in this way, if you write 2-3 paras on each of them and use some scholars and their works, it would suffice the demands of the question from third para onwards. You will write this in 2-3 pages, and after doing that, what we can do is we can criticize liberal theory of state. Every other theory has criticized liberal theory of state because This is the hegemonic theory, and other theories are to establish counter hegemony. You can even write that and then criticize these liberal theory of state from Marxist perspective, from feminist perspective, from postmodernist perspective, from socialist perspective. You can criticize the liberal theory of state from these many perspectives. So after criticizing in say one para for this, one para for this, one para for both of them, in 2-3 para you can criticize liberal theory of state. And after criticizing liberal theory of state, you can conclude that it remains the foundation of modern states and has contributed to establishing liberty, democracy, and free economy in the modern world. So you can conclude like that, and that would be about the liberal theory of state. This was a 20-marker question, so you can explain these things in detail, and you can touch upon various theories and also criticize the concept from various theories. So now moving on, we will discuss question 3b. Sorry, 3b. And 3b talks about, I think, see, this was a tricky question because it was not simply application based, it was more analytical question. It says human rights are complex and contested complex and contested social practice that organizes relation between individual, society, and state. So these are the two parts in which I broke it down: complex and contested, and organizes relation between society and state. So I would address both these parts in my main body. But before addressing them in my main body, I would start basically with intro. And in introduction, I would define what is human rights, rights that are available to everyone just by the virtue of being human. And after that, I would give historical context that human rights emerged in post-World War II era after witnessing the atrocities of Hitler on his own people. The UN and other nations decided that we need human rights. So that would be the historical context. Now we can move on to the main body. In main body, I would firstly discuss, see, as I said here, the first subpart, which is they are complex and contested. So in main body, I would try to show firstly why they are complex. And why they are complex, because one, see, if you see there are three generations of right, and second generation rights, which are socio-economic rights, can contradict first generation rights, which are political rights. So since this can contradict this, and third generation is itself very debatable multicultural rights, and giving this can lead to violation of this for some, or violation of this for some. So in this way, because of interplay between these three generations of rights, it is a complex concept. After this, I would show why contested, why human rights is a contested concept. It is a contested concept because of its universal application. Many liberal scholars say that it should be applicable universally, but this is contradicted by cultural relativists, multiculturalists, and proponents of Asian values and communitarians. So because these many schools criticize this concept, it is a contested concept. And even Xi Jinping and Putin say that it is used to justify intervention in the internal affairs of developing countries. So it remains contested. And then the second part, as I said in main body here, is to organize that it organizes relation between individual, society, and state. So how does it do that? We can show here that it organizes relation between individual, society, and state, and it does that by giving priority to the rights of human, that is individual, over the powers of states. it limits the power of state so that states cannot violate the human rights of the individual. And similarly, it says that society individual has autonomy over society. So this is how it is trying to organize the relations between individual and state. So that was the second part of the question in main body. So we have defined the human rights, we have written historical context of human rights, and since it was an analytical concept question, I broke the question down into two subparts and I tried to define both of those subparts in my main body. And after that, in main body here, by showing that why it is a contested concept, we have already criticized human rights. So now we can basically just conclude it and say that we can use the quote of SP Huntington in the conclusion. So in conclusion, we can say that SP Huntington, who said that the clash between human rights and Asian values is a reflection of a clash of civilization. So this would be a good conclusion in which some interlinkage is involved, and this is the way in which you can conclude. So that would suffice for 3B.
अब अगर आप अपीयर हो रहे हैं फॉर मेंस 2023, ज़रूरी है कि आप अपने टाइम को बहुत ही बेहतरीन तरीके से यूटिलाइज करें. एंड दैट इज़ वाई अनदर ईयर हम लेके आए हैं हमारा वास्टली सक्सेसफुल पॉलिटिकल साइंस एंड इंटरनेशनल रिलेशंस स्पेशल प्रायोरिटी ग्रुप, जो कि कंबाइन करता है हमारे लाइव क्रैश कोर्स को अलोंग विद द टेस्ट सीरीज, ताकि आप लेवल अप कर सके अपने PSIR ऑप्शनल की प्रिपरेशन में एंड मैक्सिमाइज कर सके अपना स्कोर इन मेंस 2023. इसके अंदर आपको प्रोवाइड किए जाएंगे लाइव लेक्चर्स थ्रू अ फास्ट कवरेज ऑफ सिलेबस इन क्वेश्चन आंसर फॉर्मेट. साथ ही में वैल्यू एडेड मटेरियल भी होगा ऑफ एंटायर पेपर 1 एंड पेपर 2. एंड में आपको चीट शीट्स भी अवेलेबल कराई जाएंगी. साथ ही में इसके अंदर इंक्लूड होंगी हमारी 12 टेस्ट सीरीज, जिसके अंदर 4 हाफ लेंथ टेस्ट हैं, 6 फुल लेंथ टेस्ट है एंड 2 स्पेशल डेडिकेटेड करंट इश्यूज बेस्ड टेस्ट भी हैं. Apart from this, you will also be provided with lectures and PDFs of PSIR's issues in news from January 2022 till 10 September 2023, ताकि आप dynamic events को भी जो है फटाफट कवर कर पाएं. अपार्ट फ्रॉम दिस, आपके जो मेंस के टेस्ट आप लिखेंगे, डिटेल्ड एवेल्युएशन इनकी प्रोवाइड की जाएगी विद फीडबैक विच विल बी ओरिएंटेड टूवर्ड्स इंश्योरिंग योर इम्प्रूवमेंट. साथ ही में दिए जाएंगे मॉडल आंसर्स, वीडियो सॉल्यूशंस एंड लाइव सेशंस, ताकि आप भी बेहतर एनालाइज कर पाएं कि पेपर को अप्रोच कैसे करना है. साथ ही में there will also be mentorship by selected officer candidates and telegram support group, जो कि आपके रेगुलर डाउट्स हो गए, कोई इश्यूज हो गए, उनके साथ डील करने के लिए भी बनाया गया है. तो हिस्सा बनिए SPG का एंड इंश्योर कीजिए that this means is the final means that gets you a rank in UPSC.